Wait, before you scroll past this, before you click away thinking you know everything about Hollywood, stop for just one moment. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the golden age of entertainment. We're not talking about scandals that made headlines. We're not talking about deaths that were mourned publicly. We're diving into something far darker, far more disturbing. We're talking about people who simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no answers, no closure. You believed those perfect smiles on screen, didn't you? You thought the Hollywood Dream Factory only manufactured happiness and stardom. Forget everything you think you know. Because behind those glamorous facades, behind those carefully crafted publicity photos, people were vanishing into thin air. And nobody said a word. I'm going to walk you through 10 cases that Hollywood would rather you never learned about. From a young actress whose purse was found torn apart in a dark park, to a revolutionary lawyer who made one final cryptic phone call about boarding a boat full of snow, to a folk musician who wrote farewell letters and drove into oblivion. Each story is more chilling than the last. Each disappearance raises questions that have haunted investigators for decades. Some of these stars walked away from fame deliberately, erasing themselves so completely that even their families couldn't find them. Others met fates too terrible for Hollywood to acknowledge. By the time we reach the final story, you'll understand something crucial about the entertainment industry. You'll see the machine for what it really is. And trust me, the last case will send shivers down your spine because it reveals just how easily Hollywood can make someone disappear when it wants to. But before we descend into this darkness, before we pull back the velvet curtain, do me one favor. Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Because what you're about to witness is the truth that the Dream Factory has been hiding for nearly a century. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Let's begin. The date was October 7th, 1949. A Friday evening in Los Angeles, the kind of warm autumn night when anything seemed possible in the city of dreams. John Spangler was 26 years old, tall and striking with dark hair and eyes that carried both ambition and something else, something harder to name. She kissed her 5-year-old daughter Christine good night and told her sister-in-law she was meeting her ex-husband about late child support payments. After that, she said, she had to work on a night shoot for a new film. The sister-in-law watched her cross her fingers and wink. "Wish me luck," Jean said. Then she walked out the door of their Park La Brea apartment and into the Los Angeles night. She never came back. But here's what Hollywood doesn't want you to understand. Jean Spangler wasn't some nobody trying to break into the business. She'd already broken in. She'd appeared in films with Betty Grable. She'd worked on the set of Young Man with a Horn with Kirk Douglas himself. She was a dancer at the Florentine Gardens, one of those glamorous nightclubs where the elite and the underworld mingled freely, where mobsters rubbed shoulders with movie moguls, where anything could be bought or sold if the price was right. Jean knew people. She moved in circles that most aspiring actresses never penetrated, and that's exactly what got her killed. 2 hours after leaving home, Jean called her sister-in-law. She sounded rushed, tense. The shoot was going to take longer than expected, she said. 8 full hours. She'd be home late. That phone call was the last time anyone heard her voice. The next day, John didn't come home. The police were called. And then the machinery of investigation began to turn, slowly revealing a nightmare that had been hiding just beneath Hollywood's glossy surface. On October 9th, 2 days after Jean vanished, a park employee found her purse near the Ferndale entrance to Griffith Park. The handles had been torn completely off on one side, ripped with such violence that it suggested a desperate struggle. Inside the purse, the police found no money. But they found something far more disturbing, a handwritten note. The words were in Jean's own hand, unmistakable. "Kirk," it began, "can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." Then, nothing. The note ended with a comma, as if Jean had been interrupted mid-sentence, as if someone or something had prevented her from finishing her final written thought. 60 police officers descended on Griffith Park. 100 volunteers joined the search. They combed through 4,100 acres of rugged terrain, searching for any trace of Jean Spangler. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no signs of violence beyond that torn purse. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed her whole. The investigation that followed wasn't a search for truth. It was a revelation of just how deeply rot had penetrated Hollywood's golden facade. The studio where Jean claimed to be filming closed that night. Not a single production was running. Jean had lied to her family, or someone had forced her to lie. The police began pulling at threads, and what unraveled was a tapestry of secrets that Jean had kept hidden from everyone who knew her. Friends told investigators that Jean was 3 months pregnant. In 1949, abortion was illegal. Women died in back alleys, on filthy tables, at the hands of doctors who operated in shadow. The note mentioned Dr. Scott, but no doctor by that name could be found anywhere in Los Angeles. It was likely an alias, the kind of name a woman whispers when she needs help that society says she shouldn't want. Jean might have been on her way to end a pregnancy that could have destroyed her career. She might have died on that table, her body disposed of like so much refuse, another casualty of a system that gave women fame but refused them autonomy. But pregnancy wasn't Jane's only secret. The note mentioned Kirk, and Kirk Douglas had just finished filming with Jean. He called the police himself from Palm Springs, sensing the storm that was coming. He issued a formal statement. Yes, he'd worked with Jean. Yes, he'd talked with her on set, kidded around a bit. She was the tall girl in a green dress. But he'd never seen her before or after that production. He'd never been out with her. The police believed him. They had to. Kirk Douglas was ascending toward stardom, and Hollywood protects its investments. So who was Kirk? Investigators dug deeper. Actor Robert Cummings told them Jean had mentioned a casual relationship, something she'd kept secret, something that gave her the time of her life. She'd never revealed the man's name. John's mother remembered a man named Kirk coming to pick Jean up once, but he'd never entered the house. He'd waited outside in the shadows, like someone who understood the value of discretion. Then there were the mobsters. Jean had worked at the Florentine Gardens, a nightclub owned by Mark Hansen and Niels Granlund, men connected to Los Angeles's criminal underworld. Through that job, Jean had entered the orbit of Mickey Cohen, one of the most powerful gangsters in California. Witnesses claimed they'd seen Jean with Davey Ogle, one of Cohen's associates, in Palm Springs. They'd seen her in Las Vegas with Ogle and Frank Nicolai, another member of Cohen's crew. And here's where this story becomes truly terrifying. On October 9th, the same day Jean's purse was found in Griffith Park, Davey Ogle vanished. He was under indictment for conspiracy at the time. The police theorized that maybe Jean and Ogle had fled together, running from prosecution, starting new lives under new names. A customs agent in El Paso later reported seeing a man matching Ogle's description with a woman who looked like Jean at a local hotel. The hotel clerk identified Jean from a photograph, but the register showed no names matching either Jean Spangler or Davey Ogle. This is what Hollywood does. It creates a web so tangled that truth becomes impossible to separate from fiction. Was Jean killed in a botched abortion? Was she murdered by a secret lover who panicked when she became pregnant? Was she executed by mobsters for knowing too much? Was she lying dead in the Mexican desert, having run away with Ogle? Or was she killed by her ex-husband, Dexter Benner, who wanted custody of their daughter so badly that he later fled to Florida with the child in defiance of court orders? The investigation generated more questions than answers. A radio DJ named Al Lazar reported seeing Jean at a Sunset Strip restaurant at 2:30 in the morning on October 8th. She was arguing with 2 men. When Lazar approached the table to do one of his famous tableside interviews, the men waved him away. The restaurant owner confirmed the sighting. Jean had been there. She'd been angry. She'd been with men who didn't want attention. Some investigators came to believe that Jean had been murdered by Dr. George Hodel, a celebrity doctor whose lavish home sat mere miles from where Jean's purse was found in Griffith Park. Hodel was a prime suspect in the Black Dahlia murder, the infamous killing of Elizabeth Short, another young woman with Hollywood dreams who'd been found mutilated in a vacant lot in 1947. Hodel's own son later came forward with evidence suggesting his father had been a serial killer, a man who preyed on beautiful young women, who killed for sport and got away with it because of his wealth and connections. Jean Spangler looked eerily similar to Elizabeth Short. Both were dark-haired beauties trying to make it in Hollywood. Both vanished from the same neighborhoods, from the same nighttime landscape of dreams and nightmares. But nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever arrested. The Los Angeles Police Department, corrupt and compromised, let the case grow cold. Louella Parsons offered a $1,000 reward for information about Jean's whereabouts. For years, on every anniversary of her disappearance, the Los Angeles Times ran a story asking if anyone knew what had happened to Jean Spangler. The answer was always the same: silence. This wasn't an investigation. This was Hollywood protecting itself. Because if the truth about Jean Spangler came out, if the public learned how deeply connected she was to the city's criminal underworld, how closely the studios worked with mobsters, how many young women disappeared after seeking illegal medical procedures, the entire facade would crumble. So Jean Spangler became a mystery, a cautionary tale, a ghost story. And the machine rolled on, grinding up new girls, new dreams, new bodies. John's daughter, Christine, grew up without her mother. Her father took her to Florida, denying Jean's own mother even visitation rights, as if erasing Jean from the family history could somehow undo the horror of what had happened. To this day, Jean Spangler remains listed as a missing person by the LAPD. Her case file is still open, still unsolved, still mocking every person who ever believed that Hollywood was anything other than a beautiful trap. But if Jean Spangler was destroyed by Hollywood's underbelly, the next person on our list was crushed by its indifference. And her story proves that you don't need mobsters or murder to make someone disappear. Sometimes all it takes is a world that refuses to listen. In the early 1950s, if you walked through Greenwich Village on the right night, you might have heard a voice drifting from a small apartment window. A woman's voice, soft and melancholic, singing songs that sounded both ancient and startlingly modern. Songs about loneliness and longing, about hearts that break in slow motion, about the way we all end up alone in the end. The voice belonged to Connie Converse, and she was creating the future of American music. But nobody was listening. Nobody cared. And that indifference would eventually drive her to do something unthinkable. Connie Converse was born Elizabeth Eaton Converse in 1924 in New Hampshire. She was brilliant, the kind of mind that devours knowledge with desperate hunger. She won a full scholarship to Mount Holyoke College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in America. But academic achievement wasn't enough. Connie wanted something more, something that her strict Baptist upbringing couldn't provide. She wanted art, she wanted music, she wanted to create. So in the middle of her college career, she dropped out, changed her name, and moved to New York City to chase a dream that nobody else could see. Greenwich Village in the 1950s was the beating heart of American counterculture. Beatniks and bohemians filled the coffee shops, arguing about Kerouac and Ginsberg, about jazz and freedom and everything their parents' generation refused to understand. Connie fit right in. She taught herself guitar, she wrote poetry, she painted and drew cartoons, and she began writing songs that were unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. Here's what you need to understand about Connie Converse. She was a pioneer. She was creating the singer-songwriter genre years before Bob Dylan, years before Joan Baez or Joni Mitchell, years before anyone else thought to combine personal poetry with folk melodies in the way that would come to define 60s music. Her songs were intimate, intelligent, emotionally complex. They explored feminine experiences that male folk singers ignored. They dealt with sexuality and individualism with a frankness that was shocking for the time. Connie Converse was doing in 1954 what everyone else wouldn't do until 1964. A friend of hers, a cartoonist named Gene Deitch, believed deeply in her music. He recorded her songs on his home reel-to-reel equipment, capturing Connie's voice and guitar in the quiet of his living room. Through Deitch's connections in television, Connie was given a rare opportunity. In 1954, she appeared on CBS's The Morning Show, performing her original songs for a national audience. This should have been the moment everything changed. But nothing happened. No phone calls followed, no offers came. Not even a letter from a curious listener. The performance faded away, and Connie returned to playing her songs in apartments, surrounded by friends who admired her talent but had no way to help her career move forward. For years, Connie kept trying. She recorded demos, she contacted music executives, she performed wherever she was allowed to sing. Again and again, every door remained closed. At the time, The folk scene was dominated by traditional songs and familiar voices. A woman writing deeply personal, introspective music simply did not fit the industry's expectations. Connie's work was not rejected outright. It was quietly ignored. In 1961, just weeks before the folk revival truly exploded in Greenwich Village, Connie made a difficult decision. She left New York and moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, believing it was time to build a different life. And in many ways, she did. She devoted herself to academic work and social causes. She became an editor for the Journal of Conflict Resolution at the University of Michigan. She worked passionately on issues she cared about and spent years building a life far removed from music and performance. But over time, those around her noticed a change. The energy that once defined her began to fade. She seemed increasingly worn down by disappointment and loss. In 1972, the journal she had worked so hard for was relocated without her involvement, leaving her feeling displaced once again. Friends encouraged her to travel, hoping a change of scenery might help. Others reached out, trying to support her in their own ways. In August 1974, shortly after her 50th birthday, Connie wrote letters to those closest to her. The letters were thoughtful, reflective, and deeply personal. She spoke about her fascination with humanity, about feeling unable to find her place in the world, and about the need for change. She asked her loved ones to remember her with understanding rather than worry. Then, she packed her belongings into her Volkswagen Beetle and left Ann Arbor. Her nephew watched her drive away, guitar in the car, waving goodbye as she disappeared down the road. She was never seen again. What happened after that remains unknown. No trace of Connie Converse or her car was ever found. Some believe she sought a quiet place to begin again under a new identity. Others believe she simply vanished into the vastness of the country. The truth remains a mystery. And then, decades later, something extraordinary happened. In 2004, more than 30 years after Connie disappeared, Gene Deitch brought those old reel-to-reel recordings to a New York radio station. When one of her songs was played on air, listeners were overwhelmed. Phone lines lit up. People asked who this woman was. They wanted to hear more. At last, Connie Converse had an audience. It just arrived far too late. In 2009, an album of Connie's songs was released. How sad, how lovely. Critics called her a pioneer, a genius, a precursor to every great singer-songwriter who came after her. Her music has inspired contemporary artists like Karen O and Laurie Anderson. A documentary was made about her life. A PBS special explored her disappearance. 50 years too late, the world finally recognized what Connie Converse had been trying to tell them all along. But Connie wasn't there to hear the applause. She'd vanished into the American landscape, one more casualty of a system that chews up artists and spits out their work decades after they're gone. Her disappearance is more heartbreaking than death because it leaves everyone who loved her in purgatory, never knowing if she suffered, never knowing if she found peace, never knowing if somewhere she heard that her music had finally found its audience and wondered what might have been. Connie Converse proved that you don't need mob connections or dark conspiracies to destroy someone. All you need is a society that refuses to value what they're creating until it's too late. Hollywood and the music industry killed Connie Converse not with violence, but with silence. And that might be the most damning indictment of all. But if Connie disappeared because the world wouldn't listen, our next subject vanished because he listened to the wrong voices, and his final phone call would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Oscar Zeta Acosta was not a man who disappeared quietly. Everything about him was loud, excessive, larger than life. He was a lawyer who threatened to sue his way to justice. He was an activist who demanded rights for people the system had written off. He was a writer whose semi-autobiographical novels peeled back the skin of American racism to expose the infected tissue beneath. And he was Hunter S. Thompson's partner in crime, the real-life inspiration for Dr. Gonzo in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the 300-pound attorney who consumed drugs and chaos in equal measure. In May 1974, Oscar Acosta made a phone call to his son Marco from somewhere in Mexico. "I'm about to board a boat full of white snow," he said. Those were the last words anyone heard from him. Oscar Acosta vanished into the Mexican landscape, and to this day, nobody knows if he's buried in an unmarked grave, sleeping at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, or scattered across the Sonoran Desert by men who had reasons to want him dead. Oscar was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1935 to Mexican-American parents who'd crossed the border looking for opportunities that Mexico couldn't provide. The family moved to California's San Joaquin Valley, to a small rural community where Oscar grew up feeling caught between worlds. He wasn't Mexican enough for some, wasn't American enough for others. That tension would define his entire life, driving him to spend decades trying to figure out where he belonged. He joined the Air Force. He became a Baptist preacher in Panama. He came back to California and went to law school at night while working during the day. He passed the California bar exam in 1966, and somewhere along the way, he started using drugs, not casually, not recreationally. Oscar Acosta consumed substances the way other people consume oxygen, desperately and constantly, as if chemicals were the only thing keeping him tethered to a reality he found unbearable. In 1968, Oscar moved to East Los Angeles and discovered the Chicano movement. For the first time in his life, he found a cause worth fighting for. The movement was about celebrating Mexican-American identity on its own terms, about fighting the systemic racism that treated Chicanos as second-class citizens, about demanding justice from a legal system designed to keep them oppressed. Oscar became the movement's lawyer. He defended students who'd walked out of their high schools to protest substandard education. He represented members of the Brown Berets. He took on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch because they were too political, too dangerous, too likely to provoke retaliation from the police. In 1970, Oscar ran for sheriff of Los Angeles County. His platform included a commitment to the ultimate dissolution of the sheriff's department itself. He wanted to dismantle the very institution he was seeking to lead. It was provocative, radical, and absolutely sincere. Oscar earned more than 100,000 votes. He lost, but the campaign proved that he'd tapped into something real, that people were ready for someone who spoke truth to power. This is when Oscar met Hunter S. Thompson. The Gonzo journalist was in Los Angeles working on an article about the death of Ruben Salazar, a Mexican-American journalist who'd been killed by a sheriff's deputy during the Chicano moratorium in August 1970. Thompson needed someone who understood the community, who could explain the rage simmering beneath the surface. Oscar became his guide, his source, his friend, and their relationship evolved into something electric and dangerous. Thompson invited Oscar to join him in Las Vegas. What happened there became legend. The two men consumed staggering amounts of drugs and alcohol, careening through casinos and hotels like forces of nature, pushing every boundary they could find. Thompson wrote about their adventures in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, transforming Oscar into Dr. Gonzo, the 300-pound Samoan attorney whose appetites matched Thompson's own. Oscar was furious at first. Thompson had changed his race, had turned him into a caricature, but eventually Oscar agreed to let the book be published as long as his real name and picture appeared on the cover. The relationship between Thompson and Oscar was complicated. They were brothers and competitors, allies and rivals. They pushed each other toward extremes that neither would have reached alone. And Thompson saw in Oscar something that terrified him. A man with no fear, no boundaries, no instinct for self-preservation. A man who believed he would die at 33, just like Jesus Christ, and who seemed determined to make that prophecy come true. Oscar stopped practicing law in 1972 to focus on writing. He published Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo, a semi-autobiographical novel about a lawyer fighting for marginalized people while struggling with his own identity. The next year, he published The Revolt of the Cockroach People, a fictionalized account of the Chicano movement and the events surrounding Ruben Salazar's death. Both books were raw, angry, brilliant. They captured the frustration of people who'd been ignored for too long, and they established Oscar as an important voice in Chicano literature. But Oscar was burning out. The drugs were taking their toll, the movement was fragmenting, the legal battles were wearing him down. And somewhere in his mind, the conviction that he would die young was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. In May 1974, Oscar traveled to Mazatlan in Sinaloa, Mexico. He told people he was going to cover stories, to gather material for new books, to escape the pressure that had been building in Los Angeles. But the truth is probably more complicated. Oscar had connections to dangerous people. He moved in circles where violence was common and life was cheap. Whether he went to Mexico to die or whether he stumbled into death by accident, the result was the same. His last conversation was with his son, Marco. "I'm about to board a boat full of white snow," Oscar said. Most people interpret white snow as a reference to cocaine. The implication is that Oscar was boarding a boat for a drug deal. And in the world of 1970s, narcotics trafficking, drug deals that went wrong ended in unmarked graves. Hunter S. Thompson spent years trying to find out what happened to his friend. He investigated. He wrote a long Rolling Stone article called "The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat," trying to piece together Oscar's final days. Thompson believed that Oscar had either been murdered by drug dealers or was the victim of a political assassination. The Mexican government had reasons to want Oscar dead. He was vocal, unpredictable, connected to revolutionary movements that threatened the status quo. It wouldn't have taken much to make him disappear. Other theories suggest that Oscar suffered a mental breakdown and wandered into the desert to die, or that he overdosed and his body was dumped where it would never be found, or that he staged his own disappearance, seeking the kind of mythology that would preserve his legacy. In December 1986, Oscar Zeta Acosta was declared legally dead in absentia, but declaring someone dead doesn't answer the questions. It doesn't explain what happened on that boat. It doesn't tell us if Oscar suffered or if death came quickly. It doesn't give his family closure or peace. What Oscar's disappearance reveals is how easily people can vanish when they become inconvenient. Oscar was too loud, too radical, too uncontrollable. He threatened powerful people. He exposed corruption. He refused to play by rules that were designed to keep him in his place. And when he crossed into Mexico, into a landscape where American laws meant nothing and violence was a tool of governance, he became vulnerable in ways he'd never been before. The boat filled with white powder may have been Oscar's last reckless attempt to chase escape, or it may have symbolized something deeper, a final moment of chaos before everything went silent. Whatever the truth, Oscar Acosta boarded that boat and never returned. His story, like his whereabouts, slipped into history. Hollywood, which had once embraced him for his intensity and unpredictability, quickly moved on. But if Oscar's disappearance was sudden and chaotic, the next one unfolded slowly and deliberately, a disappearance shaped with the same care as the words that defined its author. And it began with a letter that still puzzles researchers more than a century later. Ambrose Bierce was 71 years old when he made the decision to leave the life he knew behind. Whether driven by exhaustion, disillusionment, or something more complicated, those close to him sensed a man who felt finished with the world around him. His personal losses were immense. His health was deteriorating. The sharp, biting voice that made him famous was fueled by decades of grief, anger, and disappointment. In October 1913, Bierce announced that he would revisit the Civil War battlefields of his youth, places tied to memory, loss, and survival. He traveled through the American South, sending letters along the way, reflecting on the past and the present with his usual dark clarity. In December, he crossed into Mexico, a country then consumed by revolution. The fighting between revolutionary forces and the federal government had turned entire regions into war zones. Bierce, ever drawn to conflict and contradiction, wanted to see it for himself. He traveled near Pancho Villa's forces as an observer, witnessing scenes of destruction and upheaval. He continued writing letters, describing what he saw with the detached precision of a lifelong journalist. Then, on December 26, 1913, from the city of Chihuahua, he sent what would become his final known message to a close friend, Blanche Partington. It ended with a sentence that has echoed through history. "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." After that, Ambrose Bierce disappeared. No confirmed sightings followed. No remains were identified. No official record explains what happened to him after he left Chihuahua. His fate remains one of the great unresolved mysteries of American literary history. Over the years, theories have multiplied. Some suggest he was caught in the violence of the revolution. Others believe he was mistaken for someone else in a place where misunderstandings could be fatal. A retired American priest later collected local stories from northern Mexico, claiming an elderly American writer met his end there. A gravestone was even placed, carefully worded to acknowledge uncertainty rather than fact. Other accounts tell a different story, that Bierce never traveled far into Mexico at all, and that the narrative itself was part of the mystery. Bierce was a master of irony and misdirection. He understood the power of ambiguity. In letters written before his disappearance, he spoke openly about mortality, aging, and the appeal of leaving on one's own terms, statements that some interpret as preparation and others as literary flourish. There are even theories that Bierce returned quietly to the American West, vanishing into a landscape vast enough to erase a man without witnesses. If so, he succeeded completely. Ambrose Bierce left behind no answers, only questions. And perhaps that was intentional. For a writer who spent his life exposing the absurdity of certainty, disappearing without explanation may have been his final perfectly constructed sentence. There's even a theory that Bierce survived the revolution and lived out his final years in New York, dying quietly in Saratoga Springs in the company of a woman he'd fallen in love with. It's a gentle ending for a man who despised sentimentality, and it's almost certainly false. What makes Ambrose Bierce's disappearance so perfect is that it's exactly the kind of thing he would have written. A man vanishing into chaos, leaving no trace, forcing everyone to speculate endlessly about his fate. It's ironic and absurd and very human, and Bierce understood that irony and absurdity define the human condition more accurately than any noble sentiment. The man who wrote An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, a story about a Confederate soldier's dying hallucination, had created his own dying hallucination. He'd written himself into history as a mystery, and whether he died in battle, by execution, by suicide, or in some completely different way, he achieved exactly what he wanted. He made himself immortal through absence, but Bierce's disappearance, dramatic as it was still about death. The next stories aren't about people who died. They're about people who chose to vanish while they were still alive, and that distinction makes them infinitely more disturbing. Because these are stories about Hollywood stars who had everything and decided that nothing was preferable to playing the game any longer. Greta Garbo didn't disappear in the traditional sense. Her body didn't vanish. She wasn't murdered or lost to history. But in 1941, at the height of her fame, when she was the most recognizable face on the planet, Greta Garbo did something that nobody in Hollywood had ever done before. She walked away, completely, irrevocably. She made one final film, Two-Faced Woman, watched it fail at the box office and said, "That's enough." She never made another movie. She never gave another interview. She never appeared on television or at award ceremonies or charity events. She didn't gradually fade from the spotlight. She turned it off like a light switch. The woman who had defined Hollywood glamour, who had made the phrase, "I want to be alone," iconic, actually became alone. She spent the next 50 years living as a recluse in New York City, walking the streets in oversized sunglasses and practical clothing, hiding from the photographers who still chased her, refusing every offer to return to film, every invitation to speak about her career, every attempt to pull her back into the world she'd abandoned. This wasn't retirement. This was erasure. Greta Garbo deleted herself from public life so completely that entire generations grew up knowing her only as a name, a reference point for old Hollywood glamour, without any real sense of who she'd been or why she'd left. And she never explained herself. Not once. She took her reasons to the grave, leaving everyone to speculate about what had driven the most famous woman in the world to choose obscurity over fame. Some say she was exhausted by the constant scrutiny, by the impossible standards of beauty and behavior that the studio system imposed. Others believe she simply realized that the person Hollywood had created, Greta Garbo, wasn't real, and she needed to find out who she actually was beneath all those layers of makeup and myth. Whatever the reason, her disappearance was absolute, and it proved that you could be the biggest star in the galaxy and still find a way to vanish. Marlene Dietrich's disappearance from public life was not the result of decline or scandal. It was a carefully chosen retreat. Throughout her decades in Hollywood, Dietrich was not only an actress, but a master architect of her own image. She understood lighting, camera angles, costume, posture, and presentation with near-technical precision. Directors and cinematographers often deferred to her instincts because she knew exactly how she wanted to be seen. Dietrich was fully aware that Hollywood granted women power only as long as youth and illusion could be maintained. Aging was the one force she could not fully control. Rather than allow the industry or the public to redefine her in later life, she chose to withdraw entirely. After leaving Hollywood, she settled in her Paris apartment and gradually eliminated nearly all face-to-face contact with the outside world. For years, she refused visitors and categorically rejected photography. Even close friends and family members were often kept at a distance. Biographers later noted that mirrors were covered or avoided, reinforcing the idea that Dietrich was intent on preserving the version of herself that existed in public memory, not confronting the physical reality of aging. Her isolation was not driven by loneliness, but by a desire to protect the legend she had spent a lifetime constructing. Despite her physical absence, Dietrich did not completely sever her ties to the world. She maintained long, regular telephone conversations with friends, collaborators, and confidants. Her voice remained present even as her image vanished. This allowed her to stay intellectually and emotionally connected without surrendering visual control. When she died in 1992 at the age of 90, the few photographs that appeared in newspapers shocked the public. The glamorous figure who had defined cinematic sensuality and elegance now appeared frail and elderly, something audiences had never been allowed to witness. The contrast was jarring, not because of who she had become, but because of how successfully she had hidden that transformation. Marlene Dietrich's final years serve as a powerful illustration of the cost of enduring fame. Her retreat was not an act of weakness, but of authorship, choosing how her story would end, even if that choice required disappearing entirely. In preserving the myth, she sacrificed visibility, reminding the world that legends are often maintained through absence as much as presence. Brandon DeWilde carried one of Hollywood's most difficult burdens, extraordinary success at an age too young to understand its consequences. His performance as the wide-eyed boy in Shane, 1953, made him instantly recognizable to audiences across America. The role permanently associated him with innocence, vulnerability, and childhood idealism, qualities that audiences embraced, but that later became impossible to escape. As DeWilde grew older, the industry struggled to see him as anything other than the child he had been on screen. This is a familiar pattern in Hollywood history. Child actors are celebrated early, then quietly sidelined when their appearance and voice change. The very image that once guaranteed success becomes a limitation. For DeWilde, that transition proved especially difficult, not because of a lack of talent, but because the public memory of him was frozen in time. Unlike many former child stars, Brandon DeWilde did not reject acting. Throughout his teenage and adult years, he continued working steadily. He appeared in stage productions, television dramas, and feature films, earning respect as a disciplined and serious performer. He took roles that challenged him creatively, hoping to establish a career defined by growth rather than nostalgia. However, Hollywood remained hesitant. Casting decisions often favored novelty, and the industry rarely invested in reshaping the image of a former child star. DeWilde's career never collapsed, it simply narrowed. He worked without scandal, without public controversy, and without the tabloid attention that followed so many young actors of his generation. His withdrawal from the spotlight was gradual and quiet, the result of diminishing opportunities rather than personal failure. By the early 1970s, he was better known to theater audiences than to moviegoers, a shift that reflected both his persistence and the industry's limitations. In 1972, Brandon DeWilde was killed in a car accident at the age of 30. His death abruptly ended a career that had only begun to redefine itself. For many, it felt less like the loss of a fading star and more like the disappearance of a second chance, an actor finally moving beyond childhood fame, just as time ran out. Brandon DeWilde's story remains one of Hollywood's quiet tragedies. It illustrates how early fame can shape a life long after the applause fades, and how success achieved too soon can become a shadow that follows an artist forever. Barbara Payton's story stands as one of the most unsettling examples of Hollywood's ability to elevate and then completely abandon its own stars. In the late 1940s, she was widely promoted as a rising talent. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and capable of strong on-screen performances. Studios positioned her as a future leading lady, and for a brief moment, it appeared she was on the path to long-term success. Behind the scenes, however, Payton's personal life began to collide with the rigid expectations of the studio system. Hollywood at the time demanded strict control over its actresses, especially women whose careers depended heavily on public image. Payton became involved in highly publicized romantic relationships, including affairs with influential figures. Rather than offering protection or guidance, the industry responded with judgment. Her private struggles quickly became professional liabilities. As her reputation suffered, so did her career. Roles diminished, studio contracts disappeared, and the same system that had promoted her as a star quietly withdrew its support. Payton also struggled with substance dependency, a problem that was widespread in Hollywood but rarely acknowledged openly. Unlike powerful men whose careers often survived similar behavior, Payton found herself increasingly isolated and unemployable. By the late 1950s, Barbara Payton had effectively vanished from the film industry. She was no longer appearing in movies, no longer featured in magazines, and no longer protected by the studios that had once invested in her image. Reports later revealed that she experienced periods of homelessness, a dramatic and devastating contrast to the glamorous life she had once been promised. For years, the public largely forgot her. There were no major comebacks, no celebratory retrospectives, and little effort to understand how such a rapid fall could occur. Barbara Payton did not simply fail, she was discarded. Her life became a stark example of how Hollywood's golden era often offered opportunity without safety, fame without stability, and success without compassion. Her story remains a sobering reminder that the industry's spotlight can disappear as quickly as it appears, leaving behind those who were never given the tools to survive once the applause ended. Irene Dunne had been one of Hollywood's most refined and respected actresses, admired for a rare combination of elegance, emotional depth, and versatility. During the 1930s and 1940s, she moved effortlessly between dramatic roles, romantic comedies, and musicals, earning both critical acclaim and widespread popularity. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Dunne maintained a reputation for professionalism and dignity in an industry often defined by excess. At the height of her career, she was one of Hollywood's most reliable stars, frequently paired with top actors and trusted with complex leading roles. Yet, as the studio era began to fade, Dunne made a decision that set her apart from many former stars. Rather than cling to relevance or accept diminishing roles, she chose to step away entirely, on her own terms. In her later years, Dunne withdrew from Los Angeles and deliberately closed off her public life. She declined interviews, avoided film retrospectives, and refused invitations to appear at tributes or nostalgia-driven events. Hollywood, eager to celebrate its past, wanted to preserve her as a symbol of a bygone era. Dunne resisted. She had already given decades of her life to the industry and saw no reason to relive it endlessly for public consumption. Her disappearance was not fueled by bitterness or scandal, but by clarity. Dunne valued privacy, faith, family, and personal fulfillment over continued visibility. She redirected her time toward charitable work and personal pursuits, choosing a quieter existence far removed from cameras and audiences. Irene Dunne did not vanish because she was forgotten. She vanished because she chose to leave. Her retreat stands as a rare example of an artist recognizing when enough had been given and having the strength to protect what remained. In an industry that often demands lifelong access to its stars, Dunne's silence became a quiet act of self-preservation. Anne Savage became one of the most recognizable faces of film noir, a genre defined by moral ambiguity, emotional intensity, and quiet danger. On screen, her presence signaled volatility, characters who were sharp, unpredictable, and often emotionally destructive. Unlike the glamorous heroines of classical Hollywood, Savage embodied a darker realism that made her performances unforgettable. Her most famous roles cemented her image as a woman audiences feared and remembered in equal measure. But that same image also became a limitation. As film noir declined in popularity during the 1950s, Hollywood had little interest in reshaping actors who were so closely associated with its harshest edges. Savage was rarely offered roles outside that narrow identity, and the industry made little effort to adapt her talents to changing tastes. At some point, Anne Savage simply stepped away. There was no formal announcement, no farewell interview, and no attempt to preserve her visibility through nostalgia or reinvention. She stopped appearing in films and quietly exited the public eye. Unlike many stars who faded slowly, Savage's disappearance was abrupt and complete. Her withdrawal suggested a conscious decision rather than defeat. The characters she portrayed lived in worlds of betrayal, desperation, and emotional conflict. As Hollywood moved on, Savage chose not to chase relevance within an industry that no longer valued what she represented. Instead, she opted for a private life beyond the reach of cameras and public expectation. Anne Savage did not vanish because she lacked impact. She vanished because her era ended, and she refused to linger as a relic of it. Her story reflects how Hollywood often celebrates intensity only temporarily, discarding it once it becomes inconvenient. In leaving quietly, Savage reclaimed something her characters never could: control over her own ending. What unites all these stories is choice. These were people who looked at Hollywood and decided that survival meant vanishing. They understood something fundamental about fame. It's not sustainable. It eats you alive. It transforms you into a product, a commodity, a thing that exists only to be consumed by audiences who will discard you the moment you no longer entertain them. And these people chose to discard Hollywood first. But as deliberate as those disappearances were, they pale in comparison to our final story. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't about someone who chose to leave. It's about someone who was erased, someone the system decided it was done with, someone who learned too late that in Hollywood, when they want you gone, they have ways of making you disappear that are far more effective than murder. You want to know the real horror? It's not the disappearances we can explain. It's not Gene Spangler's torn purse in Griffith Park, or Oscar Acosta's final phone call, or Ambrose Bierce's letter from Chihuahua. Those are mysteries, sure. Those haunt us. But they're comprehensible. We can imagine what might have happened, can construct narratives that make sense even if we'll never confirm them. The real horror is this. Hollywood is a machine designed to manufacture illusion, and one of its most important functions is making people disappear without anyone noticing. Not physically. The physical disappearances are dramatic, but they're rare. No, Hollywood specializes in a different kind of vanishing. It erases people from memory. It airbrushes them out of history. It ensures that careers end not with spectacular crashes, but with slow fades into irrelevance, into poverty, into obscurity so complete that when these people finally die, nobody notices because nobody remembers they existed in the first place. Think about that. Think about how many actors and actresses and directors and writers and musicians you've never heard of. People who were famous once, people who had their moment in the spotlight, people who believed they'd achieved something permanent. And then the industry moved on. New faces replaced old ones. New stories displaced familiar ones. And the people who'd given everything to Hollywood found themselves discarded, forgotten, erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed at all. That's the system Gene Spangler was trying to navigate. That's the indifference that destroyed Connie Converse. That's the machinery that treats human beings as disposable resources, extracting every ounce of value before tossing them aside. And it's still operating today. The names change, the technology changes, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical. Hollywood gives you fame, and in exchange, it takes everything: your privacy, your identity, your autonomy, your humanity. And when it's done with you, it doesn't even bother with a proper disposal. It just stops returning your calls. Look at the pattern. Gene Spangler was working as an extra, trying to break through to bigger roles. She got involved with powerful people, Dangerous people, people who could give her opportunities or destroy her completely. And when she became inconvenient, when she became pregnant or learned too much or threatened to expose the wrong secrets, she vanished, not metaphorically, actually vanished, and the investigation was perfunctory, designed more to create the appearance of justice than to actually find truth. Because finding truth would have meant exposing how deeply corrupt Hollywood was, how closely the studios worked with organized crime, how many women were dying in illegal abortion procedures, how much violence and exploitation underpinned the glamorous facade. Connie Converse created revolutionary music that should have made her famous, but the industry wasn't ready for a woman doing what she was doing. So it ignored her. And that indifference was more destructive than any act of hostility could have been. Because at least hostility acknowledges that you exist. Indifference erases you while you're still breathing. Connie spent 10 years trying to get someone, anyone, to care about her music. And when nobody did, when the world made it clear that it had no use for her genius, she drove away and never came back. That's not a voluntary disappearance. That's murder by neglect. Oscar Acosta disappeared in Mexico, probably killed by drug dealers or political operatives or someone who had reasons to want him dead. But Oscar had been dying for years before he stepped onto that boat. The drugs were killing him. The stress was killing him. The impossible pressure of being the Chicano movement's lawyer, of fighting battles he couldn't win against systems designed to crush him, of living in Hunter S. Thompson's shadow while trying to establish his own literary identity. Oscar was already a ghost when he vanished. The physical disappearance was just the final step in a process that had started long before. And the people who chose to vanish, Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich and all the others who walked away, they understood something essential. Hollywood doesn't let you leave. If you try to retire normally, if you try to gradually step back from the spotlight, it clings to you. It demands retrospectives and interviews and tributes. It wants to monetize your nostalgia. It needs you to participate in the mythology of your own career. The only way to actually escape is to vanish completely, to cut every tie, to hide so effectively that even the most persistent paparazzi can't find you. That's what these stories reveal. Hollywood is a trap. It promises dreams and delivers nightmares. It elevates people to impossible heights and then watches dispassionately as they fall. It creates stars and then extinguishes them over and over in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. And the people who vanished, whether by choice or by force, whether through violence or indifference, are testaments to that truth. The saddest part? These are just 10 examples, 10 stories out of thousands. There are countless others who disappeared in less dramatic ways, who faded into obscurity without generating headlines, who died alone and forgotten in cheap apartments, whose contributions to film and music and culture were erased because Hollywood decided they weren't useful anymore. Every single one of those invisible disappearances is a tragedy. Every single one represents a person who had dreams, who worked hard, who believed in the promise that talent and dedication would be rewarded. They were wrong. Hollywood doesn't reward talent and dedication. It exploits them. It uses people up and throws them away. And when someone becomes inconvenient or stops being profitable or threatens the system in any way, Hollywood has perfected the art of making them disappear. So here's what I want you to take from this. When you watch old movies, when you listen to music from the golden age, when you consume entertainment, remember that behind every credit, every name, every face, there's a human being whose story probably didn't end well. Remember Gene Spangler's daughter growing up without a mother. Remember Connie Converse driving into the unknown with nothing left to hope for. Remember Oscar Acosta's son receiving that final cryptic phone call. Remember all the people who vanished because the system decided they were expendable. These are just a few names, just a tiny fraction of the human cost of our entertainment. The face of Hollywood is beautiful. But if you look behind the curtain, if you examine what's actually happening in the shadows, you'll find graveyards full of dreams and bodies and futures that never happened. You looked behind the curtain. You saw what most people never see. Now you know the truth. Hollywood doesn't create stars. It manufactures disappearances, and it only matters if anyone is watching.